Good afternoon. This is the first podcast of Bad Bosses, the podcast. My name's Joe Carfi, and here with an old friend of mine kicking us off, a gentleman by the name of Angelo Testani, who's got vast experience in the banking world, been an executive for about 30 some odd years, and we're here today to talk about bad bosses. What makes a bad boss? What have our experiences been with bad bosses? So we're going to start there, and we'll talk about good bosses too, because you have a bad boss and you always have a counter to that, which is a good boss. Unfortunately, in life and in the work environment, you do encounter bad bosses no matter what you do. And hopefully, through this podcast, we're going to be able to eliminate the amount of bad bosses out there and hopefully gravitate the world towards more good bosses. With that, I'll turn it over to Ange. Ange, tell us a little bit about, your experiences, how you started out, your experiences with bad bosses, your experience as a boss, and we'll go from there.
Great. Thanks, Joe. I started in banking back in the dark ages of 1988. Spent most of my career, last 37 years, working in banking. Took a brief stint and went and worked at the insurance company, for an insurance company over in Utica for a couple years. Started out in banking as a management trainee. So right off the bat, we were trained to observe and see how bosses were working. And certainly I've been lucky in my career. I actually had more good bosses than bad, but I've had a few that have stuck out.
So let's talk about that just briefly, Ange. So when you first came in, there was a training program, and what kinds of things did they talk about? Did they talk about qualities of a good boss, things that you should stay away from that would kind of make you a bad boss / something that would make you a good boss, or they just kind of leave you to your own demise to kind of figure it out along the way?
It was an odd. They called it a management training program, but it was kind of odd because there originally wasn't a lot of focus on management skills. It was more about, here's what we do in banking. You don't know anything about banking as a 22-year-old. We're going to teach you and show you all the various departments. So you got exposed right away to, probably 15 or 20 different bosses in the course of the year and a half that was in the program. The one boss in the career that really stuck out when you asked me about this was a woman I worked for. She ran our branches. I was a branch manager at the time. She was all about appearances. You had to look the part for her to get promoted, to get any kind of promotion at all in the organization. If you weren't 6'1", 180 pounds, sorry, folks, I guess we're going to be on YouTube. You'll see I'm not 6'1" or 180 pounds. I have a face made for the podcast, not for YouTube. She immediately dismissed me at being too short for the role. She looked for guys that were of that make and model. The same thing with women. She had to look for very attractive women to promote. The only analogy I had for you with her is a story she told about appearances. And she always said her house was a disaster, so she left her vacuum cleaner plugged in the hallway. So if you came over by the house, she would always go, "Oh, I was just cleaning up."
Wow.
So that was her mindset on appearances and how things should always look, right?
So tell us a little bit about that. So you said that her emphasis was on appearances. So that's pretty interesting. So did she come right out and say, this is what we're looking for, this is what I'm looking for, you don't fit the bill, I don't care how good you are at your job, or the reason why others brought you to my attention as a manager, you don't fit the image? Was it all about the image?
It was all about the image. I had posted for a job working for her in a different capacity where I'd manage more people. And she said, well, you don't have enough experience in managing large groups of people. At the time, I had managed her largest branch in the Syracuse market. Then she hired a guy who was about 6'2", 190 pounds for that role, who didn't have the experience or the time frame managing groups that I did. So I eventually I left the bank at that point in time to prove her wrong, and went out and got hired at a health insurance company in Utica, where I'd managed a group of 30 people to start with, and then wound up actually managing our entire claims operations center of about 135 people.
Wow. So when you transitioned there and came to work for her, you were managing a branch.
Yes.
And you said you had about how many people working for you? 22?
At that time, back again in the late 80s, early 90s.
Right.
Banking was a little different. We had a lot of people. Today you go into a branch, you got about 4 people working there. At that time, I probably had 15 employees working.
Wow. Wow. And she didn't take any time. And this is something that I think may cross, industries regardless. She didn't take any time talking to your employees.
No.
Hey, how was Mr. Testani as a boss?
No.
Would you work for him again? Did he build a good team? Do you like coming to work for him? Things like that. Didn't do any of that. Just boom, made a decision.
And one of the great things about when I left and went to Utica, I wound up working for a gentleman out there, great guy. One of the lessons he taught me was he called it management by wandering. He would get up every morning, and I do this today still, and it's been about 25 years since I worked for him. I'd get up and walk around my office, say good morning to people that work for me. You check in with folks every morning. If I don't get there in the morning, they wonder where I am. Then I come by in the afternoon and they're like, oh, it's the afternoon, So it's become a routine where you just kind of check in with your folks. I think that's an example of a really good boss, someone that's going to be out there hands-on, checking in with folks every day. And, it's not always about the numbers. It's making sure your people are doing well and feeling comfortable.
You touch on something that is kind of personal to me because I like yourself. I like getting out and talking to people. But I had a boss one time, and he's right up there probably with the one you were working for. As a bad boss who basically said to me, "People are shit, Joe. And no matter what you do for them or how you treat them, they're still going to be shit." So, I didn't really aspire to his philosophy at all. And it kind of set me up a little differently. So that kind of leads me to my question is, when you work for a bad boss and after you leave working for a bad boss, what happens to them? So do you know what happened to her? How'd her career go? Did that shallowness end up coming back to bite her?
Actually, unfortunately, it did not. She continued to get promoted.
Wow.
And moved on with the company. And it surprised me that she continued.
That's scary. That's scary.
Well, shit floats.
Yeah.
Cream rises to the top, and that floats. And I think with her, she kind of floated her way up.
You touch on another thing, because I used to say this to the people that worked for me. I think, and correct me here if you think I'm wrong or this has been your experience, people think titles mean that they're better people. They're more ethical. They have compassion. They have empathy, which are characteristics that I think a good boss, good manager, good supervisor should have. But I have found that that's not always true, that, you could come across people that are vice presidents or directors or department heads, and they're not, people assume because they have the title that encompasses the compassion, the empathy, the interaction with people that they like and that they care about the people that they're working for, and they go to work wanting to be the best person because they have to set the example. And I think your experience is similar to probably a lot of people out there that's not always the case.
True. I have a brother who just loves to say that, with certain bosses, certain people, the only tool they have in their toolbox is a hammer. So they look at every problem as a nail.
Wow, that's great.
And not every problem is a nail. Sometimes you got to learn how to adjust and deal with those individuals. You can't just hammer people all the time.
That, I'm going to remember that, I think, as long as the remainder of my life here, because you're absolutely right. Yeah. And we don't want to discount that there's not challenging employees I'll be the first person to admit that I was a bad boss. There are things that I did over the course of my career that I wouldn't do now. And I became a manager at a young age in my early 20s. And I think the way you manage in your early 20s and the way you manage after you've got years of experience of working with different people, and you tend not to manage the same way. Do you think that you found that as well?
Oh, absolutely true. It's much more empathetic understanding as I've gotten older. I think, as we shared before we started talking here on air, Joe, that this is the second anniversary of my wife's passing. And you develop some empathy. And certainly as I have employees now that work for me going through something very personal, dealing with a cancer, dealing with a sick spouse, you become much more empathetic for that person. And understanding what they're going through, and you're more accommodating. You're, as I said before, you're no longer the hammer.
And you know what? I would think, and I don't know if you'd agree with me, but I think that's something that we've seen change in management over the years. I think when we started out, there were more hammers than there were people who possessed the compassion and empathy. And so tell me, if you were to hire, and I don't know if you do, but you could certainly speak to that. If you were to hire a new manager today and he was or she was going to be managing a staff, what would it be that you'd look for in when you're hiring them, or what would you take away from your career of over 30 years and you'd want them to kind of come into the work environment and maybe not make some of the mistakes that you or I made, many others, but what do you think is essential today?
Trust your people. I think, don't be afraid to let them fail to learn, especially with the younger generation coming into the workforce. If you don't trust your staff to do their job, then what do you have them there for? I've had bosses in the past that, micromanage you to the minutest detail, and that tells them you don't trust me, to do my job. If you trust it, you hire me and you pay me to come in here, and do my job. Let me do it. Stop micromanaging. Don't always look for that detail that there's something wrong. So trust your people, and then, as I said just a minute ago, have some understanding and some empathy as they're going through hard times. Bad things happen to good people.
So I just want to back up for a minute. And again, we've talked quite a bit, but, losing your wife, a lot of people, so that, I haven't lost my wife, but I certainly lost a parent. And when you're in the work environment, these are things, one of the things that I learned over the years is that you never know what's going on with somebody's personal life. I always used to tell our team that, if a coworker is short with you and you're close to them, it may not have anything to do with you. And I don't know if that's been your experience, but, I found that, a lot of times when there's conflict in the work environment or things that seem out of sorts amongst colleagues who normally would get along, that, is it something that's going on that has nothing to do with your coworker or your job per se, but has something to do with, what you've gone through, what I've gone through, losing a parent, losing a spouse, which is a tremendous loss.
You asked earlier, about my experiences being a boss, and and I've made some mistakes. I think we all have. And at one point, I remember sitting with this younger woman and telling her, "This is what we want you to do now," and that's not what I want to do. And I said, "Well, that's understand what you want to do, but this is what the bank wants you to do, and this is what you're going to do." And she goes, "But I don't want to do that." And I said, "Look, I always wanted to play center field for the New York Yankees, yet here I am today, having never set foot in center field at Yankee Stadium." And she wound up leaving my office, and I found out after the fact that she had some stuff going on personally, and I probably could have been a little more understanding than throwing out my center field story, or my lack of baseball abilities, I guess.
Do you think today it's possible for somebody to walk in the door? And I don't have a definitive answer. It's just something that I've thought about over the years. Is it possible, or do you think it's learned behavior? Are you going to get somebody to walk in the door? Because certainly a manager at 25, because you and I could attest to that, isn't going to manage the same way at 25 that they did at 35, maybe even 45 or 55.
Yeah, I hope. Yeah, I hope that those people learn as they age. I think I have. I think I've, I was a young branch manager when I, was in banking and doing the branch thing, and I think I've changed. I got out of managing people for a while. Was just doing basically sales. So, or as a lender, sales is lending, or lending is sales. I didn't manage anybody then, and it was great to be on your own and not have to worry about that. And then an opportunity came up to go to my current employer, where now I manage a small group of people again, and actually hired my former boss.
Oh, that's great.
He got tired of managing people, and he was looking for something to do, and we got talking. I go, what if I could work something out? You come over here. So,
and you know what? That speaks volumes to the quality of your character. That you could actually have somebody you worked for work for you. That's great. That's very rewarding, I would think.
Yeah, I've also known him since 1988. Yeah. We've got along very, very well.
So as we're wrapping things up, I'm thinking, out in the workforce, people coming into the Bad Boss podcast. You being the first guest, you and I working together over the years, starting in different careers. What advice would you give those just specifically starting out, whether, they're going into the workforce and, you want to tell them this is the type of boss you want to stay away from? characteristics that they may want to look for? And then on the other end of that, a new manager coming in and starting out, what would your advice be to them, if they were going to be leading a group or a team and managing people?
Like I said earlier, trust your people. You hired them for a reason, but don't be afraid to hold them accountable either. One of the things I always did as I moved into a new role as a manager was laid out my expectations, met with each individual and put it in a piece of paper and laid it out for them and said, this is what I expect, from you in this role, from anybody in this role. And it was the same for each person in similar roles.
One of the things I want to throw out there, and we'll talk about it in future podcasts, but one of the things I really want to get your perspective, because I know your father is retired from the United States Postal Service. My dad was retired; he was a union man as well, retired from the New York Telephone, and then later on Verizon. But one of the things that I learned, and I used to tell the people that work for me, is you're only as good as your word. So I used to tell people, my word is my bond, and I find that you don't find that a lot today.
No.
But there were times where I felt that I had to go back on that, and I would always try to tell people, there's Joe Carfi, the human being, and then there's Joe Carfi, the boss, and sometimes they're in conflict. And unfortunately, I have to do what the employer says, and I wonder if you ran into circumstances like that as well.
Yeah, and there was when I was with a previous bank, we had to do layoffs. They came to us and said, these are mandatory layoffs in every branch. And it made no sense to me that you could look at branch A in a vacuum and say, okay, this is the worst person in branch A, but they're better than everybody in branch B. But you had to lay that employee off in branch A, and everybody in branch B had to stick around. And it became very hard as I worked through those layoffs.
Yeah.
And try to explain to folks, I know you're better than what's going on over there. They know that, but unfortunately the layoffs are happening here and not there.
So, as we wrap it up, I want to say, we're going to get into a lot of different things because, being a boss and being a bad boss versus a good boss, and being what, hopefully further episodes, what makes a good leader as opposed to a manager, as opposed to a boss. But, wondering if later on down the road you'll come back and engage with us again and see how it goes and have more stories. And, there's so many different dynamics to being a boss that we want to get the word out there. You don't want to be a bad boss. It's bad bosses have ruined people's lives. They've affected the way people eat, drink, communicate with their own families because they had to work for a bad boss. And we really want to see that change. So I hope that you'll come back to us and we'll have another conversation, hopefully in a couple of months or a year from now. And we'll have many more bad boss stories to talk about.
Anytime, Joe. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Ange. Really appreciate it.